The King Who Ate Himself to Death, the grotesque fate of Adolf Frederick of Sweden. On February 12, 1771, the King of Sweden died after eating 14 servings of his favorite dessert. This is not a joke. This is not an exaggeration. This actually happened. History remembers the dramatic deaths. Julius Caesar stabbed on the Senate floor, Marie Antoinette meeting the guillotine, Abraham Lincoln shot at the theater. These deaths shaped nations, sparked revolutions, and echo through centuries. But sometimes, the strangest deaths, the ones that seem too absurd to be true, reveal just as much about their era as any assassination or battlefield demise. King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, monarch of one of Europe's great powers during the Age of Enlightenment, did not die in battle. He was not poisoned by rivals or struck down by disease. He died because he literally could not stop eating, culminating in one catastrophic final meal that would make him forever known as the King Who Ate Himself to Death. His death was so bizarre, so utterly preventable, and yet so perfectly representative of the decadence and dysfunction of 18th century European royalty, that it deserves to be remembered as one of history's most darkly comedic cautionary tales. This is the story of how a king's gluttony became his epitaph. The unlikely King Adolf Frederick was never supposed to be king. Born in 1710 as a minor German prince in the small duchy of Holstein-Gottorp, he seemed destined for the unremarkable life typical of lesser nobility. Perhaps a military career, maybe a bishopric. Certainly not a throne. But European dynastic politics had a strange way of elevating the unexpected. When Sweden's previous royal line died out in 1751, the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag, found themselves in need of a king. Sweden at this time was not an absolute monarchy, but rather a parliamentary system where the monarch held limited power, a situation that had existed since 1719, after the death of the autocratic Charles XII. The parliament wanted a king who would be compliant, unthreatening, and easily controlled. Adolf Frederick, a bland and unremarkable prince with no power base of his own, seemed perfect for the role. He was essentially selected to be a figurehead, a man to wear the crown, perform ceremonies, and otherwise stay out of the way while the real business of governance happened in the Riksdag. From the beginning, his reign was defined by powerlessness and frustration. He tried repeatedly to assert royal authority and was repeatedly slapped down by Parliament. On one memorable occasion in 1756, he became so frustrated with his lack of influence that he threatened to abdicate. The Parliament's response was essentially, "Go ahead." He backed down, humiliated. Imagine being surrounded by the trappings of royalty, the palaces, the servants, the jewels, the portraits painted of you in ermine and gold, while having less real power than a modern middle manager. You could not declare war, could not make laws, could not even appoint your own ministers without parliamentary approval. You were a living symbol, a breathing piece of furniture in your own palace. For Adolf Frederick, this existential frustration found an outlet in the one arena where he could exercise unlimited control, his own appetite. The culture of excess. To understand Adolf Frederick's fatal gluttony, we must understand the food culture of 18th century European courts. This was the age of conspicuous consumption, where royal banquets served not just as meals, but as displays of power, wealth, and refinement. A typical royal dinner might feature dozens of courses, hundreds of dishes, exotic ingredients shipped from across the globe, and presentation so elaborate that the food itself was almost secondary to the spectacle. The Swedish court, though not as wealthy as Versailles or Vienna, still maintained impressive standards of culinary excess. Multiple meals throughout the day were expected. Breakfast might include cold meats, breads, cheeses, and small beer. Dinner, the main meal served in early afternoon, could last hours and include numerous courses, soups, fish, roasted meats, game birds, vegetables prepared in butter and cream, elaborate pastries, and always desserts. And Adolf Frederick loved his desserts. Contemporary accounts describe the king as a man of enormous appetite, particularly for sweets. His favorite dessert was Semla, a traditional Swedish sweet roll made from wheat bread, filled with almond paste and whipped cream and served in hot milk. These are not small pastries. A single Semla is a substantial, rich, heavy dessert that would satisfy most people's sweet tooth for a day. They are dense with almonds, cream, sugar, and butter, served in a bowl of warm milk that adds even more richness to an already decadent treat. The king didn't eat one Semla or two. According to historical records, he would routinely consume multiple servings in a single sitting, washing them down with champagne. His physicians warned him. His wife, Queen Louisa Ulrika, herself a formidable and politically ambitious woman, expressed concern about his eating habits. But in a life where he controlled so little, Adolf Frederick exercised absolute sovereignty over his dinner plate. The Fatal Feast, February 12, 1771. The day began like any other at the royal palace in Stockholm. Adolf Frederick, now 60 years old and notably corpulent after years of indulgence, prepared for what would be just another Tuesday in the life of a powerless monarch. He had no great affairs of state to attend to. Parliament saw to those. No pressing decisions awaited his judgment. Just another day of ceremonial appearances and, of course, meals. The dinner that day was particularly elaborate, even by royal standards. The menu, preserved in palace records, reveals a feast of staggering proportions. The king began with lobster, that prized delicacy of Nordic waters, prepared in butter and cream. He moved on to caviar, Russian sturgeon roe, salted and served with the traditional accompaniments. Then came sauerkrakt, that humble preserved cabbage elevated by royal kitchens into something more refined. Smoked herring followed, along with champagne to cleanse the palate. But Adolf Frederick was just getting started. After these appetizers, and yes, everything mentioned so far was merely the beginning, he proceeded through the main courses. The exact details of every dish are lost to time, but contemporary accounts mention roasted meats, game birds, and multiple side dishes. The meal went on for hours, course after course, each one washed down with wine or champagne or both. Finally came dessert. His beloved Semla was served, those magnificent cream-filled pastries swimming in hot milk. The king had one, then another, and another. According to the historical record, meticulously kept by scandalized courtiers who witnessed the spectacle, Adolf Frederick consumed 14 servings of Semla. 14. Imagine the scene. The King of Sweden, already bloated from hours of eating, calling for yet another bowl of cream-filled pastries and hot milk. The servants, perhaps exchanging worried glances, none the less complying after all. He was the king. the courtiers pretending not to notice as their monarch descended into pure gluttony. His wife, if present, likely long since having given up trying to moderate his behavior. And then, after the 14th Semla, the king's digestive system simply gave up. The aftermath: Adolf Frederick fell ill almost immediately. The palace physicians were summoned, but what could they do? The king was suffering from acute digestive distress, what we might today call gastrointestinal perforation, or more simply, his stomach had ruptured from overfilling. In the 18th century, there was no surgery that could save him, no emergency intervention possible. He suffered through the night in agony. Contemporary accounts describe him as being in extreme pain, unable to keep anything down, his body essentially poisoning itself from the inside. By the morning of February 13, 1771, King Adolf Frederick was dead. The official cause of death was recorded as digestion problems, or in some accounts, apoplexy, a catch-all term for sudden death. But everyone knew the truth. The king had eaten himself to death. Specifically, he had died from consuming 14 servings of semla, along with a massive feast that would have challenged the capacity of 3 or 4 normal people. The news spread quickly through Stockholm, then throughout Sweden, and eventually across Europe. The reactions ranged from shock to disbelief to, and we must be honest here, barely suppressed laughter. Here was a king, supposedly chosen by God to rule, who had died not in any noble pursuit, but from sheer, uncontrolled gluttony. Satirical pamphlets began circulating. Political enemies of the Swedish court used the king's death as evidence of royal decadence and incompetence. Queen Louisa Ulrika, a proud and politically astute woman who had spent her marriage frustrated by her husband's weakness and her own lack of power. Women, of course, could not rule in their own right, now had to manage the embarrassment of this grotesque death. How does one maintain royal dignity when the king has literally died from overeating? Their son, Gustav III, ascended to the throne. In one of history's interesting ironies, Gustav would become one of Sweden's most capable and politically active monarchs, staging a coup in 1772 to restore royal power and presiding over a golden age of Swedish culture. He succeeded precisely because his father had been so weak, so ineffective, and ultimately so ridiculous. Adolf Frederick's pathetic death helped pave the way for his son's restoration of royal authority. Parliament could hardly claim moral superiority after allowing the king to eat himself into the grave under their watch. The cultural legacy. In Sweden today, Adolf Frederick is remembered primarily for his death. Semla, that cream-filled pastry that killed him, remains a beloved Swedish tradition, especially popular during the period before Lent. Bakeries across Sweden sell millions of semla each year, and the king's fatal last meal has become part of the pastry's folklore. Some Swedish bakeries even advertise the king's favorite dessert, with knowing references to the quantity he consumed. It has become a source of dark national humor, a reminder that even kings are subject to the laws of biology and basic common sense. Tourist guides in Stockholm sometimes point out the palace where the fatal feast occurred, usually with a chuckle. But beyond the comedy lies a more serious historical lesson. What this death reveals. Adolf Frederick's death was not just about one man's lack of self-control. It was a symptom of deeper problems in how European monarchy functioned in the 18th century The problem of powerless monarchy. Adolf Frederick's gluttony was, in psychological terms, likely compensatory behavior. Denied power in every other aspect of his life, unable to affect policy or assert his will on any matter of importance, he exercised tyrannical control over the one thing he could command, his own consumption. Food became the battlefield where he could finally be absolute. The decadence of court culture, the very fact that such feasts were possible, that a king could request 14 servings of rich dessert and be served them without question, reveals the disconnection between royal courts and reality. While ordinary Swedes worked to feed their families, their king was literally eating himself to death in a palace. The weakness of ceremonial monarchy. The entire episode demonstrated the absurdity of maintaining expensive monarchical systems that wielded no real power. Taxpayers funded this elaborate court, these massive feasts, these dozens of servants, all to support a man who contributed nothing to governance and died in the most undignified way imaginable. Medical knowledge of the era. The physicians who attended Adolf Frederick were helpless to save him. They had no understanding of digestive physiology, no concept of gastrointestinal perforation, no surgical techniques that could address his condition. His death is a reminder of how recently modern medicine has developed. A king died from something that today might be prevented by simple portion control or, at worst, emergency surgery. The broader context. Europe in 1771. Adolf Frederick's death occurred at a fascinating moment in European history. This was the Age of Enlightenment, when philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were questioning traditional authority, when the first stirrings of democratic ideas were challenging monarchical systems, when reason and science were supposedly displacing superstition and tradition. Yet here was a king, literally representing the old order, dying because he ate too much dessert. The year 1771 was also marked by significant events that Adolf Frederick's death overshadowed in Swedish consciousness. Russia was expanding its power under Catherine the Great. The American colonies were 5 years away from declaring independence. Revolutionary ideas were fermenting in Paris. The world was changing rapidly, moving toward an era where hereditary monarchy would face existential challenges. And in the midst of all this historical significance, the King of Sweden died from overeating. Conclusion. The meaning of an absurd death. History gives us two types of lessons. The first comes from great events, wars, revolutions, discoveries that obviously matter and clearly shape the future. The second comes from small, absurd moments that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and social systems. Adolf Frederick's death belongs to the second category. It teaches us that power without purpose breeds self-destruction, that decadence divorced from responsibility leads to decay, and that even kings, perhaps especially kings, are subject to the fundamental laws of cause and effect. You cannot eat 14 cream-filled pastries after a massive feast and expect your body to simply accommodate your royal wishes. The king who ate himself to death remains a footnote in most history books, if he appears at all. His reign accomplished little of lasting significance. No wars were won in his name, no great reforms bear his signature, no artistic or cultural achievements mark his era. He is remembered, when he is remembered at all, for dying in the most ridiculous way imaginable. And yet, in that very ridiculousness, lies something profound, a reminder that mortality does not respect crowns, that biology does not bow to rank, and that sometimes the most absurd deaths teach us more about an era than all the carefully orchestrated ceremonies and official histories ever could. So the next time you're tempted to have just one more dessert, remember King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. Remember that on February 12th, 1771, a man wearing a crown and surrounded by luxury died because he could not control his appetite. Remember that even absolute power over the dinner plate can have absolutely fatal consequences. And maybe, just maybe, stop at 13 Semlas instead.